Today we're going to learn about a new method when it comes to structuring your layouts inside websites. And this is something that's quite new when it comes to 2017, and it's something that's going to fix a lot of the problems we have with the traditional way we structure layouts inside websites. Now the method we're going to learn about is something called CSS grids, and it's something that's going to hopefully replace the traditional way we do layouts inside websites. Now the typical way we would do it, which we still do today, is that let's say we take a website like the one I made here in front of me. As you guys can see, I have different elements inside this website, and on the top here I have a title, I have a header, then I have a sidebar and the main content next to each other, and then I have a footer at the bottom here. Now the way most people set this up today is by having a HTML file, I can actually show you guys right here, that has all the different elements inside of it, like the title, the header, the main content, the sidebar, and then the footer at the bottom here. And the way we need to structure it inside the document is the exact way we want to see it inside the browser, meaning that if I want to put something next to each other like the sidebar and the main content, I need to have it beneath each other inside the code, otherwise I can't put these next to each other. And we do that using something called float. And this is where the problem is, because let's say that I want to make my website responsive, which today in 2017 is something you have to do when you make websites. Because it's 2017, most people use their phones or their tablets to see websites, so we need to make our websites responsive. And this is where the problem is, because let's say that I, on my computer inside the browser, want my website to look like this. So I want to have the title at the top, I want to have the header, I want to have the sidebar, I want to have the main content, and then I want the footer at the bottom. But let's say when a person uses this on a cell phone, that I want my footer to appear at the top here, next to the title. Maybe there's some information in the footer that I want to have in the top, but today, using our traditional way of setting up documents using HTML and CSS, it is not possible to do this. Well, technically we can do it if we were to make a copy of the footer inside our HTML file, put it at the top here next to the header, and then display none when we have it inside the desktop format, and then display block when we have it inside cell phone format. But because we do that, we then have extra code inside our document, which is not healthy. It takes much longer for the page to load, and it just looks messy inside the code. So the way that CSS Grid fixes this is by telling the browser where we want the elements to appear once we're inside the different formats, such as a cell phone, tablet, or desktop. And this means that inside the HTML document, it doesn't matter where the HTML is compared to the other HTML elements we have inside the document. So if I were to go back inside my code, it wouldn't matter if I put my h1 tag here, delete it, put it at the bottom here right underneath the footer. If I save it, go inside my browser and refresh, you guys can see it looks the exact same way as it did before. And this is something that is incredibly cool when it comes to CSS, because today, because of the way that we build websites, we need to have some kind of new system that allows for us to put content exactly where it needs to be without us being stuck using HTML in order to define where we want the elements to appear inside the website. So just to demonstrate what I mean, I can actually go ahead, take this website here, and what you guys will notice is that when I start minimizing the screen, you guys can see that the content starts jumping around inside the page. So when I get down to the tablet format, you guys can see suddenly all the content shift around inside the page, and the footer is not at the bottom anymore, it is at the very top up here. I can also size it down into cell phone format, and then you guys can see that all the content can be customized inside the browser using CSS. And this is the part of the video where you guys start asking me in the comments, well, we have Bootstrap. Now, at the moment, I can't speak for the future, but at least right now, Bootstrap is based on the traditional way we do layouts inside websites, meaning that the thing that Bootstrap is trying to fix for you is the exact same thing that CSS right now can do for you without the need of Bootstrap. Except for Bootstrap cannot right now shift the content like I showed you guys with the footer and put it on top of the website when we have it structured like this inside our HTML page. Bootstrap cannot do that at the moment, maybe they can in the future, if they start incorporating this CSS grid inside Bootstrap. But right now, we cannot do it unless we use CSS grids. So let's go ahead and go back and just put the h1 tag at the top of the page again. And I'm going to show you guys how to use the CSS grid inside HTML and CSS without the need of JavaScript, because JavaScript used to be the way that we would have to do this if we wanted the footer to appear at the top instead. But now, like I said, we can do it only using HTML and CSS. So as you guys can see inside my documents here, I have a HTML file, which you guys can download inside the description of this video if you want to have this exact HTML file, or you can just go ahead and copy it and put it inside your own file. The one thing I want you guys to notice here is that I have a very basic HTML file. And inside the file here, I just simply link to a style sheet, which I have on the side here. And I went ahead and deleted everything inside my style sheet except for the reset code that I created at the top here, just to get rid of any unnecessary margins or paddings. And if you go back inside the HTML file, you guys will see that I have one div wrapped around all the content inside this page here called site. So I gave it a class called site. And inside this div, I went ahead and inserted my h1 tag, my header, my main, my aside, and my footer tags. So these are the HTML tags that are going to have all the content inside my front page, okay? So what we do here is we use the div that I wrapped around the content called site to define that this is going to be part of a CSS grid. The way we do that is by going into our code inside the style sheet. I'm going to say we style the class called site, and then inside this class, we're going to say we want to display this as a grid. Now inside this grid, I need to define how I want my layout to be like. And we do that using CSS by using the new code that allows for us to actually do this, called grid dash template dash column colon semicolon. And then after the colon, we need to decide how many grids we want to have inside the website going down vertically. So if we were to open up my website here, you guys can see, I didn't actually refresh the browser yet, so you guys can see the old styling. But the main idea here is that right now inside the browser, when we look at it, you guys can see that if we were to look at the columns only, right now we have two columns. We have this section here, and we have this section over here. And the only reason we have two columns is because I want the sidebar and the main content to be next to each other inside this format here. So what I need to do is I need to go inside my code and say, okay, how large do I want my columns to be? And it just so happens that we have a new type of measurement called fractions inside CSS, which simply says, okay, how much of a fraction of the website do you want this column to take up space? So if we were to say that I want 50-50%, usually in the past, we would say 50% and then 50% like this. But right now using the new measurements, we can actually say 1fr space 1fr. So now that I did this, I can actually go down to the next line and define how many rows do I want to have inside this page. So I can say grid dash template dash rows. And then inside here, I just need to go back to the website or inside the HTML file if we haven't actually created the website yet and say how many rows do I want. So inside my HTML file, I can see I have an h1 tag that I want to go from left to right. Then I have a header tag that I also want to go all the way from left to right. Then I have the main content and the aside, which I want to be in the same row, meaning that this is going to be one row. And then I want the footer to go left to right as well. So inside my CSS code, I can actually say that I want one fraction because of the h1 tag. Then I want one fraction for the header tag. Then I want one fraction for the main content and the sidebar. And then I want one fraction for the footer, like so. So now that we created a grid inside our website using CSS, we can actually go ahead and take the HTML elements over here and tell the browser where we want to put them inside the grid. So I can actually go ahead and go to the next line here and say that we have a h1 tag that has a class as page title and tell it where to put it inside our grid using CSS. So I'm going to go ahead and say curly brackets. Now, when it comes to placing the HTML elements inside the grid, we have two different methods we can use. The first one that I want to show you guys is the complicated one, but because it shows the concept of CSS grids a lot better than the second method, I'm going to show you guys this one first. Then afterwards, I'm going to show you guys the easier method, which you guys will probably use in the future when you make websites. So in order to place the page title inside our grid, what we're going to go ahead and do here is define the column that we want to put it inside of. So I'm going to say we have a grid dash column. And then we need to tell it which column it should start at and which column it should end at. Now, when we create a grid inside a website, what we have right now, according to our code up here, you guys can see we have one frame and one frame, meaning that we have two columns inside the browser. Now, if I were to draw this on a piece of paper, we have one line, then we have another line, which is one column, and then we have a third line to define a second column. because we have 3 lines inside the column, we need to tell it that we want to start at line 1. And because I want the page title to go all the way from the left side to the right side, it should go all the way to line 3. Because, like I said, we have 3 lines inside 2 columns, and it should go from the first one to the third one. Okay? Afterwards, we need to define a grid row. Like so. And the same way as with columns, we need to define the lines. So because we have 1 line, then a second line, which is 1 row, then a third line, which is a second row, we need to tell it that we want it to go from the first line to the second line, like so. And now we're just going to go ahead and copy this and paste it underneath each other a couple of times. And then we're going to change the second one to masthead, because that's the class of my header over here. We're going to change the class of the third one to main-content, like so. We're going to change the class of the fourth one to sidebar. And then the last one is going to be footer, like so. Now inside the masthead, we need to change the grid column and the grid row, because it shouldn't be the same as the title up here. So inside the grid column, right now we want the header to go from the left to the right side, just like the page title. So we're not going to change the column, but the row is going to change from the second line to the third line inside the rows that we have inside the website. So we have 1 line, a second line, which is where I want the header to start, and then have the third line, which is where I want the header to stop. So what we're going to do now is we're going to change the main content and say that we want the grid column to change, because I want the main content and the sidebar to be next to each other. So I want the sidebar, and then I want the main content on the right side. So we want to say that the grid column should start at line number 2 inside the columns and go to line number 3. Then inside the sidebar, I want to start at 1 and go to 2. Now we also need to change the row. So I'm going to say we start at the third line to the fourth line. And then the same thing down with the sidebar, because they have to be in the same row. So we're going to say 3, 2, 4. And then the footer is going to be 4 till 5. Now we don't need to change the grid column, because we also want the footer to go all the way from left to right. Okay. So now if I go inside the browser and refresh, you guys can see that we have the title at the top. We have the header. Then we have the sidebar with the main content right next to it. And then we have the footer down here. Now, if we were to actually put some colors on these so we can actually see what's actually going on, I did actually insert a couple of divs inside my HTML file, inside the different elements. So let's actually go ahead and style these. So inside my CSS file, I'm going to go to the bottom here and say that we have a class called green, which has a background color set to green. It has a width set to 100%. It has a height set to 100%. And then we're just going to copy this so we have for all the other colors as well, which should be about 5 colors in total. So we change the second one to red. The third one is going to be blue. The fourth one is going to be purple. And the last one is going to be yellow. So now if I were to go back and refresh the browser again, you guys can see that now all the sections make sense according to the layout we created inside the CSS file. So this was the complicated way of creating a layout using the new CSS grid. Let's actually go and make this a lot more simple by going to the first one up here called the page title, which is the first element inside our document, and delete all we have here, and instead we say grid-area. And then we just define what the name is of this area. I'm going to go ahead and say this is the index page dash title, because it's the title of the index page. And now what I basically did is I just named this specific element. So what I can do now is I can copy this, replace all these elements down here, and then change the name afterwards. So I can go up to my masthead and say we have an index dash masthead. I have a index dash content, and then I have an index dash sidebar, and then an index dash footer. So now what we can actually do is, if you go back up inside our main grid that we have up here called class site, we can then go down to the next line and create another piece of code called grid dash template dash areas colon semicolon. And now we just define the position of these different sections down here inside the main grid up here. So I'm going to go ahead and go down to the next line, say double quotes, which is going to be the first row inside the grid. And then I'm going to say we have a index dash title. And then on the second column, I want the index dash title to also be stretching all the way to the second column. So we just paste it in twice. Then I'm going to go after the double quotes. And then I'm going to go down to the next line. Make sure you don't go after the semicolon, say double quotes, and then we're going to define the second row inside the grid, which right now is going to be the index dash masthead. So I'm just going to paste it in twice because it needs to go from the first column to the second column. Then I'm going to do the same thing here. I'm just going to go down to the next line, create the third row, which is going to be the sidebar. So index dash sidebar, and then the content is going to be on the right side. So we're going to say index dash content. Then we want the footer. So we go down to the last row and say we have index dash footer, and then just copy it one more time. Like so. If I go back inside the website, you guys will notice that it looks exactly the same way. And doing it this way is a lot more simple than having to try to figure out all the numbers about, well, how many rows and columns did I have inside the grid down here inside, further down inside my CSS file. So making the grid up here is a lot more simple, at least in my head it is. Now you might be asking, well, right now inside the website, you guys can see that all the content is going from the left side to the right side. What if I want to have a wrapper inside the website? Well, what we can do using the grid here is I can actually say that if I want to have white space inside anywhere of this grid, I can create it inside the CSS as well without having to create a wrapper. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go back inside my grid inside the CSS file and say that I want to have white spacing on the right and the left side of my website. So I'm going to go inside my columns inside the grid and say that I want to have one more frame on each side. So I'm going to say one frame and one frame. So right now we have 4 frames inside, or 4 columns inside the website. And now you might be thinking, well, what do we do about this down here? Because right now we just said that we have 2 columns inside this layout. Now, if we want to define a white space inside this grid down here, we can actually go ahead and use the punctuation space. Then on the right side, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to say space punctuation, and then I'm just going to copy this down on all the different rows we have down here. Like so. So now if I go back inside the website, refresh, you guys can see that now we have white spacing. Now you might be asking me, well, this is a lot of white spacing. We could also go back and not say we want 1 frame, but instead say we want to have 20%. Like so. Go back inside, refresh, and now you guys can see we changed it. Or if you guys want the wrapper to not be responsive, because right now it would actually change the distance here, we could also go back inside the code and say we want 1 frame on the sides, and instead define the width of the columns inside the middle here and say we want to have 500 pixels and 500 pixels. Like so. Go back inside the browser, refresh, and now you guys can see it's actually fixed inside the website just like a regular wrapper. Okay? Now let's say I also want to have some spacing in between these sections here, because right now the sections are kind of touching each other. What I can also do in here is I can actually go ahead and add another piece of code inside the actual grid that says grid dash gap colon semicolon, and then I want to set a gap to 10 pixels. Now if I go back inside the browser, refresh, you guys can see we now have a gap in between the sections. So now that we learned how to actually create a grid inside a website, let's actually talk about if I want to size it down into a cell phone format and I want the grid to actually change accordingly. What I can do is I can actually go down to, well, we should probably copy what we have up here. I'm going to go ahead and go down to the bottom here and add a regular CSS media query. So we can say we have a hashtag media screen space and parentheses, curly brackets, and then inside the parentheses we can actually define the width of the browser of when it needs to change the content. So we're going to say min-width colon should be 736 pixels. And now we're just going to go ahead and paste in the grid from the top here called class site. Now before we continue, I would like to talk about the one big issue that is with CSS grids. which is that right now, when it comes to browsers such as Internet Explorer and Microsoft Edge, they haven't fully incorporated the CSS Grid inside their browsers yet. Now, Microsoft Edge should actually have this incorporated after a couple of weeks after I upload this video, hopefully, but Internet Explorer is not going to have this working inside the browser. So this leads to the question, what do we do about older browsers? Well, when it comes to designing websites, a lot of experts are going to tell you that you need to design for desktop first and then afterwards focus on making it responsive for cell phones. Now, other experts are going to tell you that you need to focus on mobile first and then design for desktops afterwards. And as you guys can see, what I actually did here was I included a media query that has a minimum width as 736 pixels, meaning that whatever we put inside this media query here is going to be what we see inside a desktop browser. So when it comes to my personal opinion, I agree that you should design for cell phones first and then afterwards focus on the browsers, at least when it comes to creating the code for the website. Now, this means that people who use Internet Explorer, when they see the website, they're going to see a website in cell phone format inside their browser on the computer. And this is something that some people think is a really big issue when it comes to websites. But then again, have you actually seen a mobile version inside your browser, inside your computer? Because in a lot of cases, in most cases, the mobile version of a website does actually look a lot better than the desktop version, even if you're sitting on a computer. So one argument right now, if you were to use this right now inside your websites, is that it's not a catastrophe if people actually see this website inside older browsers, because it will still be viewable, but just as a cell phone format. So the only thing we can hope for is that in a few weeks from now that Microsoft Edge will actually support CSS grids. And I know this is kind of a long stretch, but Internet Explorer hopefully should support this in the future. So now that we pasted in the code inside the media query down here, this is how we want the desktop version to look like. So we're not going to mess with this code in here. Instead, I'm going to scroll up to the top where we have the mobile version, which again, we designed for mobile first, at least in this tutorial here. So inside the template areas, we can actually go ahead and change this according to how we want it to look inside a mobile version. So I could actually go ahead and take the index footer and move it up next to my header, which is up here. Now, because we pasted the footer next to the header up here, we can't have the footer in two places. So we need to remove the footer from down at the bottom here in order for the layout to work. Now what I'm going to do, instead of just deleting it down here, I'm just going to go ahead and say we want the sidebar to go from this row to this row, which means that the sidebar now have extra space for the content when it goes downwards. I'm going to do the same thing for the content and paste it down here, like so. So just remember, we can't have the same element multiple places unless we have it going right underneath each other or next to each other, okay? I'm going to go ahead and save it. And actually, I'm going to go ahead and remove the gap down here. So I'm going to go ahead and delete it. And then we need to change the columns and the rows up here, because now we just made some changes down here and we need to make sure that it fits the templates we have up here. So I'm going to say that instead of one frame on the side, I would like 15 pixels. I'm going to go ahead and copy that to the end here. And I would like to have one frame for the two center columns, like so. And I'm just going to keep the template rows here because they are pretty much like I want them to. Then I'm going to save it, go inside my browser, refresh. And what you guys will notice now is that when I do actually go down to cell phone format, it changes the layout to cell phone, and the footer is no longer at the bottom of the page, which, like I said, using traditional styling, we wouldn't be able to do if you weren't using CSS grids. So even with Bootstrap, you would not be able to change the content in this matter. Now, there's two more things I want to teach you guys before we end off this episode, which the first thing is that you can actually put grids inside other grids. So right now, if we were to have a huge content section down here, I could actually go ahead and insert a second grid inside this box down here and just change the layout inside this grid area, which is quite nice. Now, the second thing I want to show you guys is that we can actually put white space inside this content. So right now, you guys can see that I have the footer up here, but what if I don't want the footer to be there? What I could actually do is I go inside my code and just replace footer with a punctuation. And then I'm going to go to the bottom here and just insert the footer at the very bottom instead. So we're just going to go ahead and say we want to have index dash footer, like so, and just make sure we have the correct amount of columns. So we're going to go ahead and say we want to have the index footer one more and a punctuation. So we'll go back inside the browser. You guys can see that we now have a white space inside our layout, so we can also do white spaces. So this was all I wanted to show you guys when it comes to CSS grids. I hope you guys enjoyed this lesson. Remember, this is going to be something that hopefully in the future is going to be used by most programmers. And the only way we can get browsers to support this is by actually using it inside our design. So right now, like I said, all modern browsers do actually support CSS grids, except for Edge, which should get support after a couple of weeks from now. So the only way CSS grids can become the new standard within HTML and CSS coding is if we actually use it inside our websites. So I hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you guys next time.